Hi, everybody. Okay, so this is chapter 9, which will cover language development. So, what is language? It's actually highly debated um, because we being humans, are the only species that have language. So, language is defined as the systematic and conventional use of sounds, signs, written symbols in order to communicate or self express. But it's not that it's not only for the purpose of communication. So, communication is functional, but not all communication is considered language. For example, this is honeybees dance. So we're going to watch this video about the waggle dance, which is a term for one particular type of bee dance. Who knew that honeybees dance? Um, and it communicates very effectively where other bees in the hive can find pollen or flowers.
Honeybees have some fascinating abilities, among them being able to communicate by performing a unique dance. It informs hive mates where a newly discovered food source is located. Every cycle of this waggle dance roughly describes the shape of the figure eight. Let's rewind and look in more detail. The bee only waggles on a part of its route, the straight run, indicated here by the waved line. The secret lies in the direction of the straight run, or to be more precise, in the angle between the straight run and the perpendicular, which in this case is 90 degrees to the left. This tells the other bees that food is available 90 degrees to the left of the sun. If the angle is 60 degrees to the right, they'll be flying 60 degrees to the right of the sun.
So that essentially is very good at communicating the location of where the flowers or the pollen is, or the nectar, right? So um, bees are really good at communicating, and yet we wouldn't say that bees have language, right? Just because they're effective at communicating does not necessarily mean that that communication is the same as language. Another example is orcas. So this one's a little more difficult, by the way. If you haven't seen the documentary Blackfish, highly, highly, highly recommend it, especially with being stuck at home. But Blackfish is a docu-series or documentary about orca captivity. And this is in this segment, they're going to talk really briefly about how orcas from different pods, from different parts of the world, can't communicate with each other. So when we think about animal communication, we think, oh, well, all honeybees will be able to understand the honeybee dance, right? They're all able to understand what the dance means. So the same for any other animal that has those communications. An orca is an orca, right? So if you take the same species of orca from the Pacific and the same one from the Atlantic, they should in turn be able to communicate because they are the same species. And what they found in Blackfish is if you put different orcas from different parts of the world, again, same species, into the same pool, they can't communicate with one another, and they actually get aggressive with each other because they are so frustrated with not being able to communicate.
They live in these big families, and they have lifespans very similar to human lifespans. The females can live to about 100, maybe more, males to about 50 or 60, but the adult offspring never leave their mother's side. Each community has a completely different set of behaviors. Each has a complete repertoire of vocalizations with no overlap. You could call them languages. The scientific community is reluctant to say any other animal but humans uses languages, but there's every indication that they use languages.
So they each have, what he was saying, that they each have their own repertoire of sounds that don't overlap, suggesting that they have different ways of communication, which is effectively what we term language. So what makes human language or language, real language, different or special is that it's symbolic. So sounds represent something, right? The word cat represents a very specific thing. And usually it's a feline that is, likes to push things off of shelves or something. Right? We take these sounds and we just assign meaning to them, right? These sounds represent something. Human language is special because it's grammatical. So it's a system of rules that allows you to manipulate language. Grammar was that fun thing that you learned in middle school or elementary school explicitly, right? But it's not just, it's a set of rules that allow you to manipulate language. So you can say, I went to the mall, and it means the same thing as I was at the mall earlier today, right? I use very different sentences, and yet they convey the same meaning, right? Because the rules of language allow me to manipulate and communicate effectively. And human language is special because it has differentiation. This is where the orcas seem to also have, right? So, which is essentially that there are different languages. They vary with culture and environment, right? So I grew up in the Middle East, so I know Hebrew and Arabic. And it's very different than English, right? And then in a school, I learned Spanish. Not that I remember any of it, to be honest. But depending on what culture you are, which environment you are, will dictate, right, which language you learn. So there's differentiation in our languages. So human language is different than just general communication. It serves this function as well. It is a systematic and conventional use in order to help us communicate, but it's also symbolic, grammatical, and varies across different cultures and environment. So acquiring a language means expertise in both form and meaning. Form is the phonology, which is of words, which is the sounds of language, and the structure of words, and of course sentences. Meaning is semantics, which is what are the meanings of words and how we use them. Grammar, right? The system of rules that we apply in order to make sense of the words and sentences. So, my mom is Polish, and when she moved to the US from Poland, she didn't know English very well, and so she would mix up the order of words. So instead of saying, I want to go to the bathroom, it would sound something like, to the bathroom where I can go. And that doesn't make sense in English, right? That's just not the way it is. But in Polish, that's how the sentence was structured. And pragmatics, how the language was used, right? I went to the mall with my mother, or the mother and I went to the mall. Both of them pragmatically mean the same thing and allows us to manipulate language. So how do we acquire language, right? So if you think about when we acquire language, it happens very fast in the first couple years of life. The first words are typically between 12 months to 18 months. We like to think that babbling, we'll talk about this later again, but we like to think that babbling, where the baby goes ba, 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 or da, 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 ma, 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 is their first word, and it is sadly not. I will be extraordinarily sad. I'm still pushing Rachel to say ma, 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 but we'll see what happens. But it's not really their first word. Their first word is where they intentionally use sounds directed at a very specific thing. So if she only said ma, 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 ma to me, then it could be considered her first word. But they say ma, 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 ma to everything, and therefore it's not a word. And so children, toddlers learn and produce their first words between a year to 18 months on average. And they do it with no instruction. Yes, we talk to kids and point, and we might name things, but those are usually not their first words, oddly enough, right? And so they're just learning all of these words simply by exposure, right? And how do they do it? How is it that a baby that can't sit up, for longer than 30 seconds, needs help, crawling or walking, can produce something so complex that we are the only species that can do it? So there are multiple theories for language acquisition. We're going to talk about 3 of them. The first one is the empiricist position, or the behaviorist position. This states that language is acquired via learning theory, right? Such as operant or classical conditioning. Essentially, that the systems of reward or punishment teach children how to speak. And the reason why I start talking about this one is because it's completely discredited. There's zero evidence that the behaviorist perspective is how children learn language. Parents do not reward or punish correct or incorrect grammar. In fact, parents rarely comment on grammar for young children. Instead, they focus on meaning of words, right? We like to name things. We don't necessarily fix when they butcher the grammar of that noun. And so there's no evidence that parents focus on grammatical rules at all. In fact, they just focus on naming things. And when they make mistakes, we find it to be cute. And so I start with the behaviorist empiricist position because it's the easiest one to cover because it's not true. Okay. So what are the modern theories of language acquisition? So we're going to talk about 2 of them, and they both state that children are prepared for learning language. Prepared. They state that all humans have a predisposition for acquiring their culture's language. And this is true. And so the first theory is the nativist perspective, and the second theory is the social interactionist perspective. So the nativist perspective is essentially this general theory of language that we acquire, that we're born with, and then we take this theory of language and we modify it based on what we hear. And we'll show the evidence for that. The social interactionist perspective states that learning languages, and the reason why it's also specific for humans, is embedded in these social cognitive skills and processes. And so the reason why we have a language is because we are such social species, and that in order to acquire a language, you must engage socially. And we'll talk about evidence for that as well. So let's talk about the nativist perspective. Nativism states that the structures and processes for acquiring language are innate. Now, innate is a word that means born with, right? That it's built in. And so they state that the structure for processing language is innate and then modified by culture. Again, otherwise we would all be speaking the same language if it wasn't modified by culture. So it's this we were all born with a general ability to acquire language and then modify what we have based on our culture, so that way we're specifically focusing on our culture. And nativists take this perspective because language is universal, right? All humans have it as long as you have a species typical environment, right? Language is universal. It's biologically based. We have brain areas associated with it, as we'll discuss in a minute. It develops on a very regular and predictable developmental pattern. If children don't have their first word by the age of 3, which is the top end of that range, there is a problem. right? Usually something to do with the autism spectrum or some sort of language delay associated with brain development. And so we have expectations for when language occurs. So it develops pretty predictably and regularly, and it's mapped onto the brain. And so therefore, they pose this language instinct, this built-in ability to acquire language. And there's evidence for nativism, for this language instinct, from universal grammar, sensitive periods, and specializations of brain functions. So we'll talk about each one of these. So let's first talk about universal grammar. Universal grammar is the basic rules, grammatical rules, that typify all languages. So according to this, we are all born with universal grammar. Our brain is able to acquire a language because all languages have this basic grammar rules. Then children compare their innate general grammar to the language that they hear, and then they adjust. So let's watch this video.
In advance of experience, the child is already equipped with an understanding of the basic structure of any human language. So we know, even in advance of inquiry, that there's going to be a fundamental invariant core to language.
Linguists have come to use the term universal grammar. It's a notion that there's some underlying set of characteristics that are true of all languages all over the world.
All human languages have something that is sort of nouny and something that is sort of verby. They all do. All human languages have a way to make things negative.
No way, Jose.
No way, Jose. All human languages have a way to ask a question.
If I'm asking a question, I'll lower my eyebrows. Where are you from? What's your name? Who is that person?
All human languages have a way to indicate a difference between just one and more than one.
In the Eskimo languages, you have not only the singular, for example, ugaik, one rabbit, ugaik, two rabbits, ugaik, three or more rabbits.
And so it goes. Each language has a list of obligatory distinctions. Male, female, definite, indefinite, singular, plural, past, present. This is the stock of categories that the human mind uses to schematize experience.
And Chomsky asked the question, why is this? Why are languages so similar? Why are they all cut from the same mold? And his answer was,
There are fixed invariant principles, fixed invariant structural principles, which are simply part of the human biological endowment and that determine what counts as a human language.
it's because the human brain is pre-wired to accept only certain kinds of languages. And that the grammatical properties of the languages of the world have those properties that they do because the human mind has those properties.
Those things which are true of all languages are the candidates for what the child comes into the world knowing about the nature of the language to which he is being exposed.
The child might very well have a plan for what is a possible rule in a human language. So languages can have verbs then objects or objects then verbs, but those are two possibilities that every language has one or the other of. And the child can simply worry about which of those two versions his language has. What he's got to pick up are the particular versions of the rules that everyone else in the community is using.
So, as you just heard from the video, right, every language has things that are verby, right, verbs, things that are actions, nouns, right? We all have ways of labeling things. We all have ways of structuring a sentence. We either put the object first and the action later, or the action first and the object later, right? There's only so many rules, and our child is born able to acquire any language because it has these built-in grammatical rules that it has to just follow. Oh. And so Noam Chomsky, who proposed universal grammar, states that this basic grammar rules typify all languages, and that children then compare these rules to the language they hear and adjust. And so to do this, Chomsky proposed that humans have what we call a language acquisition device. So a language acquisition device, let me put this here, is how our mind processes language input. And so this language acquisition device has principles and parameters to make sense of what the child is hearing. Principles are things about the language that are universal. So every language has a subject. Every language has some sort of noun or verb word. And so these are things that are universal in their language, and the child just has to identify them. Parameters are aspects of grammar or language that vary across cultures. And so some languages have to use articles with subjects, some don't. So my husband, for example, is learning Hebrew because that's the language that my family speaks. And so he essentially wants to learn Hebrew now that we have a daughter, so that way I can't, talk crap to my daughter about him, or that my family can say something bad about him, which is actually really funny because we would never, but nonetheless. And he's always like, why do you have to say the, or the word the before every time you say an object? And I was like, I don't know, but that's just the rule, right? If no one teaches it to you, once you acquire that language, you don't know why you do what you do or how you speak. You just do it, right? These are the parameters that vary across your language, and you just know it. So if you know another language, whether that be Spanish, French, Mandarin, Arabic, whatever it is, each language has its own specifics, and those specifics are parameters, right? That they vary across languages. Another piece of evidence, Another piece of evidence for universal grammar is that children will invent languages when they don't already have a language option. So we don't really think about this. Like, what do you mean? Who doesn't have a language? But we're going to watch a video about children in Nicaragua that did not have a language because it was the policy back then that children that were deaf, didn't engage with other deaf children. And so therefore, they were never exposed to a sign language. And so what they did was, finally, they built a school for deaf children, and they went in trying to teach these kids essentially American Sign Language, but for Spanish. And the kids rejected it. They didn't want this language forced on them. They created their own language. They invented it. And what was surprising, what was amazing, was that it fit perfectly with what you would expect for universal grammar, because what the language that they created had all the same grammary rules that you would expect. They all had nouns and verbs. They all had ways of saying no. They all had ways of asking a question. They all had ways of forming a sentence that was either one way or the other, right? They follow these principles of universal grammar. Now, first, a language isn't just formed overnight, right? And so there's a process. First, it becomes a pidgin, then a Creole, then a language. So a pidgin is essentially a communication system that arises when people share no common language, kind of like a language soup. So, for example, Jews that were taken in World War II to ghettos. So they were taken, let's say, from Germany, and they were taken to Poland and put in the ghettos. They didn't know Polish. They only knew German, and so they had to learn how to communicate with the other people that only spoke Polish. And so they essentially made up a new language, which we now call Yiddish. This also happened when the French occupied Haiti. So now called a Creole, funnily enough. But at first, it was a pidgin where these French people needed to communicate with the Haitian language that I don't actually know that it actually still exists or anyone speaks it. And it became this new language that was just a way of forming some way of communication. And then the next generation takes that pidgin and makes it into a Creole. So this is a rudimentary foundational language that develops from a pidgin to a more complex communication system, but it's not yet a fully formed language. And then the third generation that speaks finally takes this Creole and it becomes a full formed language where it meets all the requirements of the language, right? So it's able to be manipulated. It has sounds that have very specific communication or meaning. It's pragmatic. It has grammatical rules that are modifiable. And so the process from pidgin to language takes 3 quote unquote generations. And so we're going to watch a video of what this looked like in Nicaragua.
Nicaragua, Central America. Managua. Here, as in other places of the world, there are those who hardly have any language at all. Maria no name, Mary no name. Deaf since birth, she has been isolated all her life, both from the people who could help her and from others with her disability. Her friend, linguist Judy Kegel, understands the depth of her isolation. The two can communicate just a little, using simple and primitive gestures.
The first time I met her, she was missing the ability to tell me who she was. She was missing the ability to tell me how old she was. She doesn't know her name. In order to tell me who she was, she had to take me home and show me the papers and pictures of her family. We had to share a context. She can tell me things. I can show you a bit. She can tell me what happened to her father. I asked her about her father dying, and she said 3. Okay. What 3 meant was he was shot 3 times. I know this from working with the other deaf signer that she said he was shot in 3 places. And that's how her father died, right? Yeah. Right. And, but 3 is just not enough to give me access to the information that I would have needed had I not had prior knowledge about that. Papa. Okay. What she's saying is, I had a daughter that went away and got married, and that was it. She never came back. I had a son that went away, and I never heard from him again. That's it. I'm alone. That's my life. She was language ready. The problem was she didn't get access to language within that critical period, and that critical window for learning language in the way that we learned it is closed.
This window for language remains open until we reach age 7. Then it slowly closes as we advance towards puberty. Before the 1980s, many deaf Nicaraguans were like Mary No Name. They never encountered the window for language because they never encountered others with their disability. But in 1980, after the Nicaraguan Revolution, the new government tried to enhance deaf people's lives. It brought deaf village children into Managua to end their isolation. Here, educators tried to teach them an existing sign language. The effort failed. The children showed little interest in learning a language forced upon them. Instead, they began communicating with each other in their own way. Judy Cagle was summoned from the United States to sort out the problem.
I came down thinking wherever there were deaf people, there was a sign language, and that obviously there would be a full-blown sign language in full swing here in Nicaragua. And I said, well, I can learn a bit of their sign language if that's what you want, and work with you on learning it. They said, no, they don't have a sign language. They have mimicas. They have mime gestures. And they pointed to a group of kids and said, we want to know what they're talking about.
It turned out they were talking about a lot more than anyone dreamed possible. Cagle had arrived in Nicaragua shortly after the birth of a new language.
Language needs company. Language needs a community. Language needs some sort of a trigger. And I think that trigger is, it's not so much that it needs a community in the sense that there have to be lots of people, but part of being a community is wanting to share information with each other.
Might this moment resemble what happened around 50,000 years ago? The turning point that led to the explosion of human creativity? Language does not need a voice. It is our legacy, an inevitability of being human. Today, we still don't know exactly when language evolved, when it opened the door to our phenomenal success as a species.
This is a verb, we're duplicated.
But language, every language, depends on strict rules, all of them familiar.
That's a role shift to looking at the bird, then back to the man falling off the mountain, dreaming that he's going to fly like a bird.
While many species can communicate, even vocalize, only human languages are driven by complex rules. Every one of our world's 6,300 languages has them. We call them syntax. In her isolation, Mary No Name never encountered syntax, but it is commonplace in the children's language.
Syntax isn't the set of rules that you learned in your third grade grammar that you had to memorize so you spoke English the way you're supposed to. Syntax is, or language, the constraints on language are something that all human beings share. They're the constraints that are imparted to us by the fact that we share a single human brain. They are not just the constraints, but the ability to hierarchically organize information that allows us to construct sentences, novel sentences that have never been said before, that allows us to tell a story, that allows us to prophecy, that allows us to lie. I can surely communicate for communication's sake when I have syntax. Then I can truly use a language.
And those most gifted with the tools of language might have been the ones to prosper, according to
So, as you saw in that video, which, by the way, if you want to watch the entire show called The Mind's Big Bang, this is the 6-part series, but that was just a segment of it. But as you can see, like, these children just, once they were together, once they were able to communicate or had the need to communicate, they formed this language that built upon the pidgin that was already existing, right? This home sign, these mimicas that they called, and it created a Creole. And now, 20, 30 years later, it's a full-blown language, which is Nicaraguan Sign Language. Another piece of evidence for universal grammar is the sensitive periods. So, this is essentially the notion that we have a sensitive period, sometimes called a critical window or a critical period, where language must be introduced in order for that language to be acquired. So, for example, children who experience severe social isolation never acquire language later in life. So if you remember Jeannie that we talked about early on in the semester, right? Jeannie was discovered at the age of 13, having been kept in a single room her entire life. She never was spoken to. And so even though she improved in many ways, she did not improve in language. She could never acquire, no matter how much they worked with her, she never acquired language. She was only able to acquire basic communication, such as, putting her hands to her mouth to signify that she wants to eat, or pointing in order to identify things, but she could not form language. There are many other children that are feral, right? Their parents, did something terrible where either they abandoned them in the wild or they locked them up somewhere, and so they were not exposed to language ever. But if the child was rescued or found before the age of 7, then those children, even though they weren't exposed to language for a very long time, were able to acquire language. But past the age of 7, there seems to be no ability for a child to acquire language at all if they were not spoken to. So that suggests that there's this critical time between 0 years of age to 7 years of age where your mind can learn a language, can acquire one. Also, evidence, without having to traumatize children, is that learning a second language is much more difficult the later you try to do it. So most children that grow up in the United States learn a second language in high school, usually French, Italian, or Spanish. Spanish is the most common. And so normally in class, I would ask you, how many of you learned Spanish in high school? And most of you would raise your hand. And then how many of you actually are fluent in Spanish if Spanish is your second language? And most of the time, only one or maybe two people raise their hand. Why? Because even though you took 4 years of Spanish, I took 4 years. I don't remember. I literally could only say, hello, my name is. And I know how to say cat. Just the word cat. I can't use it in a sentence. Because learning a second language is insanely difficult past this critical time. However, my first language was Hebrew, and I moved to the United States when I was 6. Thank goodness it was 6, because now I speak English fluently. In fact, if I speak Hebrew, I sound like a child. But I was able to learn a second language and become completely fluent in it without any accent. Why? Because I was exposed to that second language in this critical period, in this critical window. And if you are exposed to it later, then there's a delay in that language. So my brothers, who were teenagers when they moved to the United States, have accents and still struggle with certain vocabulary. They're not as fluent as I am because they were exposed to that language at a later age. And furthermore, brain damage to language areas early in life can be overcome, where the brain takes on the other functions, the brain parts that are still there. But damage as an adult is very difficult, and if anything, nearly impossible to bounce back from. As we'll see in a second, if you have damage to these areas of the brain later in adulthood, you cannot recover. But if it's early on, the other parts of your brain will essentially take on that function and you can still learn a language. So all of this suggests that we have a sensitive period, which again, sometimes called the critical window or critical period, where in that sensitive period, language must be introduced in order for it to be acquired. So many studies show, right, the later you're introduced to a language, the fewer words you know, the more errors you make when speaking, the fewer grammatical rules you know, the more of an accent you have. And this study essentially confirms that. Because if you're exposed to a foreign language by the age of 7, your language is essentially equal to native speakers. And so this is if you're a native speaker, your mean score of language on this measure is about 280. And if you were exposed to this language between the ages of 3 and 7, right, your score is about the same, if not even a little higher. Why is it a little higher? People often ask, like, well, why would they be higher than native speakers? And it's because if you're 3 to 7, you're actually being explicitly taught these rules about this foreign language. And so you might know a little more than someone who's a native speaker. But then immediately after the age of 7, there's a very gradual decline, right? So it's not like it's immediate where, age 7 and 2 days, that's it. You can't learn a second language or can't learn a foreign language. You could, but your proficiency, your mastery declines. Is it possible? Certainly. Is it difficult? Tremendously. And the third piece of evidence for universal grammar and the nativist perspective is the neurobiology of language, which essentially is stating that we have areas of the brain specifically geared towards language. What we're going to talk about is the Broca's area, which is right here, which is associated with speech production, and syntax, essentially how you use the words. And then Wernicke's area, which is right here, is associated with speech comprehension. And so how do we know that? We know that because damage to these areas cause aphasia. Aphasia means speechlessness, which is essentially the disturbance in either the formation or the comprehension of language. So if you have damage to Wernicke's area, you have Wernicke's aphasia. And Wernicke's aphasia is where you lose the ability to produce comprehensive speech. So you may keep some nouns or verbs, but your comprehension of the speech is non-existent. So let's see what that looks like.
I'm going to ask you some questions, and I just want you to answer yes or no. Okay? Yes or no. Is your name Smith?
What are they? What they're eating about it? I don't know. What?
Is your name Brown?
Oh, Mr. Triangle, when making and walking those things this a year for these.
Okay. Just say yes or no. Okay. Is your name Brown?
But it is here. Then let me see. I just don't know. No, I'm not going to eat any if I know.
No. Are the lights on in this room?
No. I just don't. Sorry, what you're doing, and you're just sitting walking around here.
You're doing fine. That's okay. I know it's kind of hard for you, but you're doing fine.
I can eat my own before and everything like that.
And so I'm not gonna play the rest because it's very sad. But right. So the person is asking, I just want you to say yes or no. Is your name Smith? Where would I be? What they're eating environment? I don't know, right? So they can keep the words, but the word is word soup. Like they're not producing anything that makes sense. All she has to do is say yes or no, and she cannot, right? She can produce words, but she loses the ability to produce comprehensive words that can be comprehended. Similarly, we have Broca's aphasia. Broca's aphasia is where you have damage to Broca's area. So it impacts your ability to produce language. So in this video,
Okay.
Smoke. 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 5 years. Yeah. 5 years. And drives car. Okay. Me. Drives car.
And so, as you can see here, it's a little different than Wernicke's aphasia. In Broca's aphasia, they can produce words that, the sentence makes sense, but they can't get it out, right? It impacts their language production. And so for him to explain what happened takes literally a minute and a half, where you can understand what happened, right? He got into a car accident and he had a stroke 5 years ago, right? That's the gist of it. And it took him almost a minute it's like pulling teeth for them to be able to produce these words. And so all of that, went ahead. All of that was evidence for a nativist perspective, right? We have universal grammar, we have areas of the brain that are associated with language, and we have these sensitive periods, these critical windows of time where we have to learn language, which suggests that we are born, right? A nativist perspective states that we are born with this ability to acquire language. It is innate. Similarly, the social interactionist perspective also states that we are prepared to learn a language. However, it says that we need social interaction for this to happen. That seeing others as intentional agents, that other people in our environment are have intentions, have social needs and desires and thoughts, is what prompts language development. And so this views language learning as less universal and more dependent on social environment. And so think about some of the evidence from for the nativist perspective is that we acquire it's very developmentally predictable, right? Children acquire their first word in the first 2 years of life on average. And so that piece of evidence is a little questioned in the social interactionist perspective, which states that, yeah, but not unless they're exposed to social environment, because otherwise Jeannie would have learned language anyway. If language learning was innate, 100% innate, then everybody would learn language. But because language learning is dependent on social interaction, those that are not exposed to language in the first 7 years don't acquire language at all, which suggests that it's highly dependent on social environment. And so, according to the social interactionist perspective, we acquire language when we have a species typical social environment. And that language does not develop independently of other things that allow us to interact socially, such as understanding theory of mind, which is the notion that others have a mind and that others have intentions and desires. Intentional agency, knowing that when you point to something, you want me to, that you have intentions and you want me to pay attention, or sharing that attention, and overall social development. So, for example, evidence for social interactionist perspective comes from potentially communicative intentions, which essentially at around 9 to 10 months, infants can attempt to direct an adult's attention. They start to point, they start to gesture. And sharing attention does what? It prompts vocalizations, usually from both the adult and the child. One of your homework videos is going to show this. And so if a mom or a dad is holding a baby and that baby points somewhere, and it's pointing, let's say, to flowers on your daily quarantine walk. And so you point to flowers and you're like, oh, you just, the baby's pointing to flowers and you just look at it and say nothing? No, the parent then says, oh, are those flowers? right? And the baby might start to mimic or imitate or coo or babble, depending on how old they are. And so sharing attention, just the child gesturing, just the child pointing, is actually a predictor of earlier language development, right? And so children who have more shared attention by mothers, um, and those mothers use language when referring to object, actually have children who develop better language skills. So the more a mother has shared attention with her child, and the more she labels and the more she communicates about what it is that they're sharing attention about. Oh, look at these flowers. Oh, look at this cat. Whatever it is, it predicts better and earlier language skills. More evidence for infant-directed speech is called motherese, or now termed IDS, infant-directed speech. So infant-directed speech is this specialized register or type of speech where we use it when we speak to children. And adults do this and older adults do it. So when we're speaking to young children, specifically infants or toddlers, we change the way we speak. So, for example, I might be talking to you like this, and if my husband were to walk in with the baby right now, I'd be like, "Hi, how are you doing? Did you have a nice nap?" Right? I would sound ridiculous if I spoke to you that way, but me literally spontaneously doing that randomly when a baby walks in is perfectly normal. But if I were to talk to you like, yeah, today we're going to talk about infant directed speech, you would literally hate me, right? It's weird. But when we talk like that to babies, it's perfectly acceptable. And in fact, it's spontaneous. Just the other day, well, not the other day, but before all this coronavirus stuff, when we were quarantined, I brought the baby to school because I needed to pick up some stuff and have some student meetings. And when I brought her to school, there was two people in the hallway having a normal conversation, just like you and I would right now. And then the second they saw the stroller, they didn't even, I could have had a doll in the stroller, right? The second they saw the stroller, they're like, hey, is that a baby? Right? And it's perfectly normal. It's spontaneous when we're talking to infants. If you had an adult that when they see an infant, they're like, hello, baby. How are you doing? Was your nap nice? Right? That's weird, right? That person, something's wrong there. And what's more amazing is that this is found around the world. Every single culture has this. Every culture. And even what's more amazing is even deaf parents, when they're making sign language gestures, they do it more slowly and they exaggerate the vowels just like we do when we're speaking. And so here's just a semi-creepy example of what this looks like.
This is all about parentese. Nobody on the planet takes a look at a baby and talks to them like a New York taxicab driver. Hey, forget about it. Stop the crying over there. Instead, if a baby is talked to like that, they'll move around and they're going. Parents, wise parents, talk to them in something we call parentese. Parentese is characterized by three responses. Number one, long vowel sounds. Yes, you. Short, clipped consonant sounds. Baby, you're good baby. And goose it way, way high. Yeah, we're good baby. Did you? Now put them all together. Yes, did you good baby? Yes, oh, yes. Yamina, good host. Yes, she good host. When you start sounding like somebody afflicted with undifferentiated schizophrenia, then you have true parentese. Thank you.
And so, again, slightly creepy. They're very exaggerated, but it is funny. Parentese is the new term because it's not just for mothers, obviously. It sounds very ridiculous, but it has a way of stretching out vowels and breaking up words so that babies can learn it. because children are way more responsive to infant-directed speech, and they will choose to listen to it over any other type of verbal or auditory stimuli. It helps infants discriminate words that sound familiar, and it helps regulate infant emotions. So babies that are spoken to in motherese are more easily soothed. They calm more easily versus babies that are spoken to with not an infant-directed speech. So which one is right? Is it the nativist perspective or the social interactionist perspective? And the truth is the question is not whether it's one or the other. They're both true. There's no doubt that we have an innate ability to learn language. We are born prepared to learn. We are not born knowing all languages, but we are born prepared to learn a language. And that happens easily, early on, and usually in a species typical environment in a very specific, predictable time period. But there's also no doubt that there's an influence of social interactions, and that language may have initially emerged due to the complexities of how we socially interact. And therefore, without social interactions, it doesn't matter whether your brain is perfectly fine. Without social interactions, early on, we do not form language at all. Okay, so that's it for part one. Look out for part two of this lecture that will discuss the rest of the chapter.